Chapter 1: The Life I Built. At 38, Nolan Webb's life ran on structure. Not just the kind he designed on blueprints every day, steel frames, load paths, tolerances measured to the millimeter, but the quieter structure of routine, responsibility, and restraint. He woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. The habit had started years ago, back when he was still proving himself as a junior engineer, and it never left him. Even now, as a senior structural engineer earning just over $200,000 a year, Nolan believed discipline was something you kept, not something you outgrew. He shaved carefully, dressed in pressed slacks and a button-down, and stood for a moment in front of the bathroom mirror. The man staring back at him looked exactly like what he was supposed to be: steady, composed, unremarkable in the best possible way. No flashy watches, no designer labels. Just a simple steel wristwatch his father had given him years ago, its face scratched but dependable. In the kitchen, the coffee machine hummed as sunlight crept through the blinds of their suburban home. Simone was already awake, scrolling on her phone at the counter, her coffee untouched. "Morning," Nolan said, pouring his cup. She replied without looking up. He noticed it, of course, the distance. He always noticed things. Engineers were trained to spot stress fractures before they became catastrophic failures. But Nolan also believed in patience, in assuming good intent. Marriage, he thought, was another kind of structure. It required maintenance, not panic. "You working late tonight?" he asked. "Probably," Simone said. "Victor invited us to something." "Not sure yet." Nolan nodded. Victor Holbrook, tech investor. Loud laugh. Louder opinions. Nolan didn't dislike him. Dislike required effort, but he never felt the need to impress him either. "That's fine," Nolan said. "I've got a review meeting anyway." He kissed her cheek before heading out. She smelled expensive, some new perfume he didn't recognize. The drive to work took 35 minutes, just enough time for Nolan to mentally walk through the day. A seismic retrofit proposal. A junior engineer's design he needed to correct gently, without discouraging him. Nolan remembered how it felt to be young in the field, smart but unsure, desperate not to make mistakes because mistakes in engineering weren't theoretical. They collapsed bridges. They killed people. His office sat on the 15th floor of a glass-and-steel building downtown. When Nolan stepped inside, he was greeted by nods and greetings. "Morning, Webb." "Hey, Nolan. Got a minute later?" He answered them all, calm and courteous, never rushed. He had earned his reputation over 15 years. Reliable, ethical, unshakable. The kind of engineer clients trusted even when projects ran over budget or deadlines tightened. Nolan never cut corners. If a design needed revision, he revised it. If it delayed things, so be it. Steele didn't care about excuses. At 10 sharp, he stood in the conference room, laser pointer in hand, explaining load redistribution to a room of executives who barely understood the math but trusted the man presenting it. "This column here," Nolan said, highlighting the diagram, "was designed with a safety factor that exceeds code by 12%. It's conservative, but it ensures long-term performance." One executive frowned. "Could we reduce that? Save costs?" Nolan didn't hesitate. "We could. I won't recommend it." Silence followed, then a nod. "That's why you're here," the executive said. By lunchtime, Nolan ate at his desk, as he often did. He scrolled through old photos on his phone while chewing methodically. One photo stopped him, as it always did. His father, George, standing outside a steel plant, helmet tucked under his arm, grin wide despite the grime on his face. George Webb had been a steelworker his entire life. No college degree, no wealth, just calloused hands and an unshakable sense of pride. He'd been adopted as a baby, raised by a couple who worked 2 jobs each and never complained. When Nolan was a boy, George used to come home exhausted, sit at the kitchen table, and say the same thing every night. "Work's honest if you give it your best," he'd say. "That's all a man really owns." When Nolan told him he wanted to be an engineer, George didn't pretend to understand it. He just nodded and said, "Then be the best one. Don't lie to the math." George died 5 years ago, quietly, from a heart attack in his sleep. Nolan had inherited nothing but the watch on his wrist and the values he lived by. And to Nolan, that felt like more than enough. That evening, Nolan arrived home just after 7. The house was quiet. Simone wasn't back yet. He loosened his tie, cooked himself a simple dinner, and ate at the table alone. He didn't mind the silence. Silence was stable, predictable. When Simone finally came in, she was glowing, laughing in her phone before noticing him. "Oh," she said, startled. "You're still up." "Long day," Nolan said. "How was it?" "Fine," she replied, already walking past him. "Just networking." He watched her go, something tight and unfamiliar settling in his chest. Not suspicion exactly, just awareness. The same kind of awareness you had when you noticed a hairline crack in concrete, small but out of place. Later, as they lay in bed, Simone faced away from him, phone lighting up the darkness. Nolan stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house he paid for, the life he had built piece by piece. He thought about the projects he'd completed, the bridges still standing, the buildings that would outlive him. He thought about his father's hands, his mother's tired smile, the belief that if you did the right thing long enough, life would eventually meet you halfway. Nolan Webb slept believing his life was solid. He believed in his work. He believed in his marriage. He believed that character mattered more than wealth. And he had no idea how much there was to lose. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Wanted More. The first changes were small enough to dismiss. A new handbag appeared on the kitchen counter one evening, its logo subtle but unmistakably expensive. Nolan noticed it while setting down his keys. "New?" he asked casually. Simone smiled without looking up from her phone. "Yeah, I've been meaning to upgrade." "Looks nice," Nolan said, and meant it. He liked seeing her happy. He didn't ask the price. Then came the shoes, the dresses, the way she started taking longer to get ready, standing in front of the mirror with an intensity Nolan didn't recognize. She'd tilt her head, step back, step forward again, as if evaluating herself the way investors evaluated assets. "You don't need to try so hard," Nolan said one night, leaning against the doorframe. "You already look great." She met his eyes in the mirror, her expression unreadable. "That's easy for you to say." He laughed lightly. "Isn't that my job?" She turned away without answering. Simone had always been ambitious. He admired that about her. When they first met, she talked about travel, success, wanting more from life than what she'd grown up with. Nolan never saw that as a flaw. Wanting more was fine, as long as it didn't require stepping on someone else to get it. But lately, her ambition felt sharper, hungrier. She started talking differently at dinner parties, leaning forward when wealthy guests spoke, laughing a second too long at their jokes. She asked questions Nolan would never think to ask. "What do you invest in? Is that property in Aspen or Vail? How old were you when you made your first million?" On the drive home from one of those dinners, Nolan kept his eyes on the road. "You were quiet tonight," Simone said. "I was listening," he replied. She sighed. "You always do that. Observe. Analyze. It's like you're standing outside the room instead of being in it." "I like knowing who I'm talking to," Nolan said. Simone looked out the window. "Some people don't want to be known. They want to be impressive." That sentence lingered in the car long after the traffic light turned green. Victor Holbrook became a frequent name in their house. Victor says the market's about to explode. Victor thinks traditional careers are dying. Victor flew in from Dubai just for the weekend. Victor was everything Nolan wasn't: loud, confident to the point of arrogance, wearing wealth like armor. When they ran into him at events, Victor clapped Nolan on the shoulder a little too hard. "My man," Victor would say, "still building the world one beam at a time." "Someone has to," Nolan replied, polite but distant. Victor would grin, flashing teeth. "I just buy the world after guys like you build it." Simone laughed at that. Nolan noticed. At home, the distance grew. Conversations shortened. Touches disappeared. She stopped asking about his day. When he asked about hers, she gave vague answers. "Busy. Meetings. You wouldn't be interested." One evening, Nolan cooked dinner, roast chicken, her favorite. He set the table, poured wine, waited. She came in late, heels in hand, phone glowing. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," Nolan replied. "Sit. Eat with me." She hesitated, then sat. Picked at the food. "You okay?" he asked. She exhaled sharply. "Do you ever feel like this is it?" Like this is as far as we go. Nolan frowned. What do you mean? She gestured around the room. This house. This neighborhood. Your job. It's all so contained. It's stable, Nolan said. We're doing well. We're doing fine, she corrected. There's a difference. He leaned back, studying her face. Simone, what's going on? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Nothing. Forget it. But Nolan couldn't forget it. He replayed moments in his head the way he replayed calculations, searching for where things stopped adding up. He noticed how she guarded her phone now, angling the screen away. How she smiled at messages she didn't explain. How she started staying out later, dressing sharper, moving faster, like she was already late for a life Nolan wasn't part of. Still, he refused the obvious conclusion. Simone wouldn't do that, he told himself. They weren't perfect, but they were solid. He had seen marriages fall apart before, loudly, dramatically. This wasn't that. This was just a phase. The truth came on a Thursday night. Nolan arrived home early, a rare thing. He planned to suggest a weekend away, something quiet. Maybe they just needed time. Simone was already home. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, posture rigid. Her phone lay face down on the coffee table. We need to talk, she said. Nolan's stomach tightened. Okay. She didn't invite him to sit. She didn't soften her voice. I've been seeing someone, she said. The words landed cleanly. No hesitation. No apology. Nolan blinked. Seeing someone? Yes. His mouth went dry. Who? She held his gaze. Victor. The room seemed to tilt. How long? Nolan asked quietly. Long enough, she replied. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact on a report. Is this a joke? No. Then why are you telling me like this? He asked. Why now? Because I'm done pretending, she said. And I'm done waiting. Waiting for what? For you to be more, Simone snapped. More driven. More ambitious. More. She waved a hand toward the window, toward the city skyline in the distance. Bigger than this. Nolan felt something tear inside his chest, slow and painful. I've given you everything I have. And that's the problem, she said. Everything you have isn't enough. He took a step closer. I love you. She looked almost bored. Love doesn't pay for the life I want. So that's it? He asked. You're leaving me for money? She laughed, sharp and humorless. I'm leaving you because you think this, she pointed at him, is the finish line. Victor thinks in scale. He thinks in millions. Nolan's voice shook despite his effort to steady it. I build things that last. And you stay small doing it, she replied. You're safe. Predictable. Replaceable. The word hit hardest. Replaceable. She picked up her phone, already turning away. I've moved on, Nolan. You should too. He stood alone in the living room. The house suddenly too quiet, too large, too empty for the life he thought he was living. Simone had changed. And now, finally, she wasn't pretending anymore. Chapter 3, destroyed from every angle. The collapse didn't come all at once. At first, it looked like coincidence. Nolan noticed it on a Monday morning when his calendar invite vanished. A project he had been leading for nearly a year gone. No explanation. He assumed it was an administrative error and walked down the hall to his manager's office. Hey, Mark, Nolan said calmly, leaning against the doorframe. Looks like the Riverside project got reassigned. Mark didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression was tight, rehearsed. Yeah, leadership decided to move things around. Leadership? Nolan asked. I wasn't consulted. Mark cleared his throat. It wasn't my call. Nolan studied him. 15 years working together, and Mark couldn't meet his eyes. Okay, Nolan said after a moment. Who's taking over? Mark hesitated. Someone external. That was the first fracture. By Wednesday, it became a pattern. Nolan was removed from meetings without notice. Emails went unanswered. His access to certain internal systems suddenly required temporary approval. Temporary stretched into days. On Friday afternoon, an HR representative he barely knew asked him to step into a conference room. The door closed softly behind them. Nolan, she began, folding her hands. This isn't easy. His pulse quickened, but his voice stayed level. What's going on? We're restructuring, she said. Your role is being eliminated. He waited for the rest. It didn't come. Eliminated, he repeated. I lead 3 active projects. I mentor half the junior staff. Yes, she said quickly, and we appreciate your service. This isn't about performance. Then what is it about? Nolan asked. She glanced at the folder in front of her, but didn't open it. The decision was made at the executive level. Based on what? He pressed. I can't discuss that. Nolan leaned back in his chair. After 15 years, I don't even get a reason? Her voice softened, but it didn't help. You'll receive a severance package. That's not an answer. She slid a document across the table. Security will escort you out. The words didn't register at first. Escort. Like a liability. Like a risk. Nolan packed his office in silence. His co-workers avoided eye contact, pretending to be busy. A junior engineer he once mentored started to say something, then stopped. It's not personal, Nolan said quietly, forcing a smile. Keep doing good work. When he stepped into the elevator, the doors closed with a finality that made his chest tighten. At home, he told Simone that evening. She listened without interruption, arms folded, eyes sharp, not shocked, not concerned. They fired you? She asked. Yes, Nolan said. No cause. She exhaled, shaking her head. Unbelievable. I'll find something else, Nolan added quickly. My reputation. Your reputation doesn't mean much if no one answers your calls, she said. The words stung. What's that supposed to mean? It means this industry is about influence, she replied. And you don't have enough of it. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He hadn't told her yet that 3 recruiters hadn't returned his emails. That an interview scheduled for the following week had been postponed indefinitely, an hour after being confirmed. Within days, Nolan realized something was wrong. Firms that once courted him stopped responding. Former colleagues sounded uncomfortable on the phone. Sorry, Nolan, one said. They went in a different direction. Who did? Nolan asked. A pause. Everyone. At night, Nolan sat at the dining table with his laptop open, job boards glowing back at him like accusations. He tailored resumes, wrote cover letters, reached out to old contacts. Nothing. Weeks passed. Savings that once felt solid began shrinking. Mortgage payments loomed. Credit cards filled with groceries and utilities. Then the divorce papers arrived. They were delivered in a plain envelope, slid through the mail slot without ceremony. Nolan stared at them for a long time before opening them. Simone wanted everything done quickly. Clean. Efficient. Just like her. He confronted her that night, papers in hand. So this is how I find out? He asked. She didn't look up from her phone. It's better this way. You didn't even talk to me, he said. There's nothing left to talk about, she replied. Victor's lawyer handled everything. That name again. Victor. The realization settled like ice in his veins. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was targeted. Nolan started connecting the dots too late. Victor's sudden interest in his work, his casual questions about Nolan's firm, the way doors closed immediately after Victor entered the picture. Power moved faster than integrity. By the 3rd month, Nolan sold his 2nd car. By the 4th, he dipped into his retirement account. He skipped meals without noticing. Every morning, he woke up believing today would be different. Every night, he went to bed wrong. The final blow came on a quiet afternoon. Nolan sat alone in the nearly empty house, furniture already listed online, when his phone buzzed. A message from Simone. No words at first, just a photo. Simone stood on the deck of a yacht, oceans stretching endlessly behind her, sunglasses on, champagne flute raised. Victor's reflection was visible in the glass behind her, smiling. Under the photo was a single line of text. Enjoy poverty. Chapter 4, Becoming Invisible. Nolan learned quickly how much of life could be reduced to numbers. Square footage, monthly rent, remaining balance, days until the next payment. The house went first, not because he wanted it to, but because denial had a shelf life and his savings had already begun to rot. The realtor spoke gently, as if tone could soften reality. It's still a good market, she said, clipboard tucked against her chest. You'll get something out of it. Something turned out to be less than Nolan expected and far less than he needed. After fees, penalties, and the quiet erosion of months without income, what remained fit neatly into a single checking account that now required daily monitoring. He sold furniture next. the dining table where he and Simone once hosted dinners, the couch they picked together because it was practical. Buyers came and went, testing cushions, negotiating like none of it had ever mattered. Each sale felt like erasing proof that his old life had existed. On moving day, Nolan loaded the last box into his car alone. He locked the door, stood on the empty porch, and looked at the house one final time. No anger, no tears, just the dull recognition that he no longer belonged there. The apartment he moved into was on the edge of the city, in a neighborhood that smelled faintly of rust and damp concrete. The building's front door didn't fully close unless he slammed it. The hallway lights flickered like they were undecided about existing. His unit was small, too small. The paint peeled near the windows. The heater rattled loudly, then barely worked. Nolan set his mattress on the floor and stacked his remaining boxes against one wall, leaving the rest of the space empty. Silence filled the room differently here. It pressed in. His phone rang the first night. "Nolan," his mother said, her voice thin but warm. "I heard from Mrs. Collins. She said you sold the house." "I did," Nolan replied. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "You could have stayed with me." He closed his eyes. "I'm fine, Mom." "You don't sound fine. I just need time." She hesitated. "I can help. I have some savings." "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. "I'm not doing that." "You're my son," she said softly. "That's what family is for." Nolan stared at the cracked ceiling. "I know, but I'll figure this out. I promise." After he hung up, he sat on the floor for a long time, his back against the wall, wondering when pride had become the only thing he had left. The job search continued, but it had become ritual more than hope. Applications sent. Follow-ups ignored. Rejections automated. When the email came offering him a position as a night janitor at St. Matthew's Hospital, Nolan laughed out loud. A short, hollow sound. The irony didn't escape him. St. Matthew's was where his mother had worked for over 20 years as a nurse. He remembered waiting in the cafeteria as a boy, swinging his legs under plastic tables while she finished her shift. He remembered the smell of antiseptic and coffee, the way staff greeted her by name. Now, decades later, he stood in a small office filling out employment paperwork for a job that required no resume. The supervisor, a stocky man named Frank, glanced over Nolan's form. "You worked construction before?" "Engineering," Nolan corrected automatically. Frank nodded, unimpressed. "This is nights. Hard work, not glamorous." "I'm not looking for glamorous," Nolan said. Frank shrugged. "Good. You start Monday." On his first night, Nolan arrived early. He pulled on the uniform, gray shirt, dark pants, name tag that simply read Nolan. No last name, no title. Frank handed him a mop and a checklist. Floors, hallways, restrooms. "Don't get in the way. Doctors hate that." Nolan nodded. Understood. The work was physical in a way his old job never was. His shoulders burned. His hands blistered. The mop bucket sloshed as he pushed it down endless corridors that smelled of bleach and sickness. People passed him constantly, but rarely saw him. Doctors walked by mid-conversation, eyes fixed ahead. Nurses hurried past, coffee cups in hand. Visitors stared through him like he was part of the furniture. Once, a man in a tailored suit stepped directly into Nolan's path without looking up. "Watch it," the man snapped. "I'm sorry," Nolan said automatically, stepping aside. The man didn't respond. Around 2 a.m., Nolan cleaned the surgical wing. The lights were bright there, unforgiving. He caught his reflection in the glass of a door, stooped slightly, sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. He barely recognized himself. During a break, Nolan sat alone in the staff room, sipping lukewarm coffee. A group of doctors entered, laughing loudly. One of them glanced at Nolan, frowned briefly, then looked away. "Was that?" The doctor started. "No," another said quickly. "Different guy." Nolan lowered his eyes to his cup. The shifts blurred together. Sleep came in fragments during the day. Nights were long, measured in tiles cleaned and trash bags emptied. One evening, as Nolan pushed his cart down the main corridor, a familiar voice drifted past him. "Nolan? Nolan Webb?" He froze. A former colleague stood a few feet away, dressed in scrubs, recognition flickering uncertainly across her face. "Oh," she said after a second. Sorry, I thought you were someone else. That's okay, Nolan replied, voice steady. She nodded awkwardly and walked away. Nolan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then returned to mopping. Payday came. The amount was small, almost insulting. Nolan deposited the check anyway and updated his spreadsheet. Rent, covered. Food, barely. Everything else, postponed. He called his mother less often now, careful not to let exhaustion leak into his voice. He told her he was busy, which was true. He just didn't tell her how. On his way home one morning, the sun rising behind him, Nolan paused outside the hospital entrance. He watched the day shift arrive, faces alert, uniforms crisp, purpose intact. No one noticed him standing there. For the first time in his life, Nolan Webb felt invisible. And invisibility, he was learning, was its own kind of weight. Chapter 5, The Cut That Changed Everything. Night shifts had a way of stretching time. By 2:17 a.m., Nolan felt every hour of it in his bones. The hospital was quieter now, but not calm. Machines still beeped behind closed doors. Carts rattled down corridors. Somewhere a baby cried, sharp and sudden, then stopped. Nolan pushed his cleaning cart toward the east wing, checklist folded in his pocket. He moved automatically now, mop, rinse, wring, repeat, his body memorizing the work even when his mind wandered. The request had come over the radio 15 minutes earlier. Maintenance hasn't responded, Frank said. Light out in the old administrative hallway. People are complaining. I'll take it, Nolan replied. Frank hesitated. You know, that's not really... I can handle it, Nolan said. Just a fixture. Frank sighed. Fine. Be quick. The hallway was rarely used, a forgotten stretch of the hospital where offices had been converted into storage years ago. The lights buzzed faintly, one flickering erratically near the ceiling. Nolan set up the ladder beneath it and climbed carefully, toolkit tucked under his arm. He'd done work like this countless times before, wiring inspections, field adjustments, hand steady even at height. Compared to calculating load transfers under seismic stress, this was nothing. He twisted the panel loose and peered inside. Dust puffed out, coating his knuckles. Of course, he muttered. He reached in, fingers feeling for the loose wire. The metal edge was sharper than he expected. The pain came a split second later. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a sudden sting like a bite. Nolan pulled his hand back instinctively and felt warmth spread across his palm. Damn it! Blood welled fast, dark and thick, sliding between his fingers and dripping onto the floor below. Nolan stared at it for a second, surprised by how quickly it came. He climbed down, heart pounding, and pressed his hand against his shirt. Okay, he said to himself. Okay. He walked toward the nearest sink, leaving a dotted trail behind him. The hallway seemed longer now. His grip tightened as he turned on the water, holding his hand beneath the stream. The blood didn't stop. It flowed freely, washing pink down the drain, soaking the sleeve of his uniform. Nolan grabbed paper towels, pressing them hard against the cut. Nothing. Hey, a voice called out. You all right? A nurse had stepped out of a nearby room, eyes widening at the sight of his arm. I'm fine, Nolan said automatically. Just a cut. That's not just a cut, she said, already moving toward him. Sit. Now. I really don't want to make a scene, Nolan protested weakly. She ignored him, guiding him to a chair. What's your name? Nolan. Nolan, you're bleeding through your shirt. She pressed a fresh stack of gauze into his hand and raised her voice. I need a wheelchair over here. I don't need, Nolan started. The room tilted. The next thing he knew, he was being wheeled down the corridor, ceiling lights passing overhead in a blur. Someone wrapped a blood pressure cuff around his arm. Another voice asked questions. Any dizziness? On blood thinners? How long ago did it happen? 10 minutes, Nolan said. Maybe 15. His hand throbbed now, pain blooming outward in steady pulses. They brought him into the emergency department through a side entrance. Nolan noticed the difference immediately. Not staff corridors, not the quiet invisibility of night work. This space buzzed with urgency. A young doctor approached, pulling on gloves. Let's take a look. He gently unwrapped the gauze. Blood pooled instantly. That's deeper than it looked, the doctor said. How did this happen? Metal edge inside a fixture, Nolan replied. I didn't see it. The doctor nodded. We'll clean it. Probably need a few stitches. Nolan swallowed. Can I just... You're already here, the doctor said. Let's do her job. A nurse cleaned the wound thoroughly. The antiseptic burned, sharp enough to make Nolan suck in a breath. Sorry, she said automatically. It's okay, Nolan replied, teeth clenched. As they worked, Nolan stared at the wall, focusing on a poster about hand hygiene. He felt strangely detached, like he was watching someone else's body being handled. The nurse paused. You're still bleeding more than I'd expect. The doctor frowned. What's your blood pressure? Lower than normal, the nurse replied. Nolan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Is that bad? It just means we're going to keep an eye on you, the doctor said calmly. You've lost a fair amount of blood. How much is fair? Nolan asked. Enough that I want labs, the doctor said. I don't think that's necessary, Nolan said quickly. I need to get back to work. The doctor met his eyes. You're not going anywhere until we make sure you're stable. A nurse rolled in a tray. We'll draw some blood, just routine. Nolan hesitated. Routine for what? Baseline, she said. Blood count. Clotting factors. Standard stuff. He nodded slowly, too tired to argue. The needle slid into his arm, smoothly. Nolan watched as the vial filled, dark red, swirling inside plastic. That's a lot, he murmured. The nurse smiled politely. You'd be surprised. They wrapped his arm, applied pressure, and finally stitched the wound closed. Nolan flexed his fingers carefully. The bleeding had slowed, but his hand felt heavy, weak. You're going to stay here for a bit, the doctor said. We want to see your labs before discharge. How long? Nolan asked. Depends on the results. Nolan leaned back against the pillow, staring at the curtain separating him from the rest of the ER. Voices drifted through, urgent, frightened, annoyed. Life unfolding around him. For the first time in months, Nolan Webb wasn't invisible. He was a patient, and somewhere beyond the thin walls of the emergency department, his blood work was already being processed. Chapter 6. Sir, this doesn't make sense. Nolan woke to the sound of a curtain being drawn. Light spilled into the small ER bay, harsh and white. His hand throbbed dully beneath the bandage, but the pain felt distant, secondary. He blinked, disoriented, trying to remember how long he'd been there. A nurse stood at the foot of the bed, tablet in hand. She smiled politely, but her eyes didn't quite match it. Good morning, Nolan, she said. How are you feeling? Like I slept on a gurney, he replied. His voice was dry. Did the labs come back? Her fingers paused on the screen for just a fraction of a second. Some of them. That pause mattered. Nolan pushed himself upright. Is something wrong? Nothing urgent, she said quickly. The doctor will be in shortly. She left before he could ask another question. Nolan sat there listening to the sounds of the emergency department waking up. Phones ringing, carts rolling, voices overlapping. He flexed his fingers again. The stitches held. The bleeding had stopped. By all logic, this should have been over already. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. A young resident appeared, holding a chart. He looked barely old enough to shave. He smiled too brightly. Mr. Webb, he said. Just checking in. Am I being discharged? Nolan asked. The resident hesitated. Not yet. What? Well, the resident said, shifting his weight. Your blood work showed a few irregularities. Irregular how? Nolan pressed. The resident glanced at the chart again. Your hemoglobin levels are unusual, and some of your clotting markers don't quite line up. Nolan frowned. Is that dangerous? Not necessarily, the resident said quickly. But it's uncommon. Uncommon usually comes with an explanation, Nolan said. The resident smiled thinly. That's what we're working on. He left, and Nolan's unease deepened. An hour later, a different doctor arrived. Older, calm, silver hair at the temples. He pulled the curtain fully closed before speaking. Mr. Webb, he said, extending a hand. I'm Dr. Patel. They shook. Nolan noticed the doctor's grip was firm, steady. I've been reviewing your labs, Dr. Patel continued. And I'd like to ask you a few questions. Please, Nolan said. I'd like answers. Dr. Patel sat on the stool beside the bed. Have you ever been diagnosed with a blood disorder? No. Any history of anemia? Clotting problems? No. Family history of anything genetic? Nolan thought of his father. Not that I know of. Dr. Patel nodded slowly, as if that response confirmed something he already suspected. You lost more blood than expected for a relatively small laceration, he said. At the same time, some of your markers suggest an unusually resilient red cell structure. Nolan blinked. That sounds contradictory. Yes, Dr. Patel agreed. It is. He stood, looking at the chart again. His brow furrowed. I'm going to consult hematology, he said. Just to be thorough. Is that normal? Nolan asked. Dr. Patel met his gaze. For cases like yours? Not really. After he left, Nolan lay back against the pillow, heart beating faster now. He tried to reason through it the way he would any problem. Input, output, cause, effect. But his body wasn't behaving like a bridge or a beam. There were no equations for this. Two doctors returned together this time, a woman in her 40s and a tall man with glasses. They introduced themselves as hematology specialists. They asked the same questions again, more precisely. Any history of transfusions? No. Adopted? No. Parents biologically related? No. The woman frowned slightly and scrolled through the lab results on her tablet. Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to focus. Did your father ever mention being adopted? She asked suddenly. Nolan stiffened. Yes, he was. Both specialists looked up at the same time. When did you find out? The man asked. As a kid, Nolan said. He never hid it. Do you know anything about his biological family? The woman asked. No, Nolan replied. Records were sealed. He didn't care to look. The two doctors exchanged a glance that Nolan didn't like. What is this about? He asked. The man adjusted his glasses. Some of your genetic markers don't align the way we'd expect based on the family history you've given us. Align with what? Nolan said. With population norms, the woman replied carefully. Dr. Patel returned moments later, carrying additional papers. He listened as the specialist spoke in low voices, terms overlapping, haplotypes, inheritance patterns, anomalies. Then something happened that made Nolan's stomach drop. Dr. Patel went quiet. Not thoughtful quiet. Not listening quiet. Staring quiet. He looked at the lab results for a long time, then slowly set them down. Sir, he said finally, turning to Nolan, this doesn't make sense. Nolan sat up straighter. What doesn't? Dr. Patel didn't answer immediately. He looked at the other two specialists, then back at Nolan. Your blood shows genetic signatures that don't match what we'd expect given your stated lineage, he said. They're statistically rare. How rare? Nolan asked. The woman hesitated. Rare enough that we need to rule out lab error first. So, it could just be a mistake? Nolan asked. It could, she said, but we don't assume that. The man nodded. We'd like to run additional tests. What kind of tests? Nolan asked, his pulse loud in his ears. Confirmatory blood work, the woman said, and a DNA analysis. Nolan laughed softly, a reflex more than amusement. DNA? For cut on my hand. This isn't about the cut anymore, Dr. Patel said gently. Nolan ran a hand through his hair. Are you saying something's wrong with me? No, Dr. Patel replied. We're saying something is unexpected. The woman leaned forward. Have you ever taken a genetic test before? No, would you be willing to? She asked. Nolan looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent lights, at the thin curtain separating him from strangers. I don't really see a choice, he said. Dr. Patel nodded. We'll proceed quietly, discreetly. How long will it take? Nolan asked. For preliminary results? The man said. Not long. Another nurse entered with a fresh tray. More vials. More labels. Nolan extended his arm without comment as the needle slid in again. As the blood filled the tubes, Nolan felt a strange sensation. Not pain, not fear exactly. More like standing at the edge of something vast, unseen. The doctor spoke in hushed tones as the samples were sealed and sent away. And Nolan Webb lay back against the pillow, unaware that the answers moving through the hospital lab were already beginning to rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. Chapter 7. The Name That Shattered Reality. Nolan had learned to wait. Waiting had become its own discipline, waiting for callbacks that never came, for nights to end, for pain to dull into something manageable. So when the doctors asked him to stay another few hours, he nodded and said nothing. He watched the second hand on the wall clock move in clean, precise increments, each tick sounding louder than it should have. Morning light crept through the high windows of the ER, turning the sterile white into something softer, almost forgiving. Nolan sat upright on the gurney, his stitched hand resting on his thigh, bandage clean now, dry. He felt fine. That was the strange part. Fine, except for the tension coiled tight beneath his ribs. A nurse came in with a cup of water. "Drink this," she said gently. "You look pale. Have you heard anything?" Nolan asked. She shook her head too quickly. "Doctors will be in soon." Soon stretched. When the curtain finally rustled again, it wasn't just one doctor. Dr. Patel entered first, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him came the two specialists from the night before, joined by a woman Nolan hadn't seen yet, mid-50s, sharp eyes, wearing a tailored blazer instead of a lab coat. The curtain closed fully. Nolan's pulse spiked. "This feels like a lot of people for routine," he said. No one laughed. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "Mr. Webb, thank you for your patience." The woman stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Elaine Morris," she said. "Medical genetics." Nolan nodded slowly. "Okay." Dr. Morris opened a folder, pages neatly clipped. "We reran your labs twice. Different machines, different technicians." And Nolan asked. "And the results were consistent," she said. Dr. Patel folded his hands. "What we're about to discuss isn't related to your injury," he said. "Your hand will heal." "That's good to hear," Nolan replied, though his mouth felt dry. Dr. Morris met his eyes. "This is about who you are." Silence followed. Heavy. Intentional. Nolan let out a short breath. "You're going to have to be clearer than that." She nodded. "We compared your DNA against multiple databases, medical, genealogical, anonymized population studies." And Nolan pressed. Dr. Patel glanced at her. She nodded once. "Mr. Webb," Dr. Patel said carefully, "your genetic profile matches a known family line." Nolan frowned. "Whose?" Dr. Morris hesitated just long enough to matter. Then she said the name. "Elliot Thornwood." The syllables didn't land at first. Nolan searched his memory, expecting something obscure. Instead, his mind produced headlines. Documentaries. The Thornwood Foundation. Steel plants that employed tens of thousands. "You mean the Thornwood?" Nolan asked. "Yes," Dr. Morris said. "That Thornwood." Nolan shook his head, a short, disbelieving motion. "That doesn't make any sense." "That's what we said," she replied. Dr. Patel slid a page toward him. "Elliot Thornwood is one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country. His family line is well documented." Nolan stared at the paper without really seeing it. "I don't know anyone like that." "We know," Dr. Morris said softly. "That's part of the problem." She took a breath. Elliot Thornwood had one child. A son. Officially. Nolan looked up. "Officially?" "Yes," she said, "but not biologically." The words settled slowly like ash. Dr. Morris continued, her voice calm, clinical. "Decades ago, Thornwood's wife was unable to conceive. Records indicate they pursued private arrangements." Discreetly, Nolan's heart thudded. "You're saying—" "I'm saying Elliot Thornwood had a biological son with another woman," she said. "A woman who gave birth in secret. The child was placed for adoption." Nolan's throat tightened. An image rose unbidden, his father at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, saying, "I was adopted, son. Never bothered me." Dr. Patel watched Nolan closely. "Your father, George Webb, matches that genetic line." The room seemed to tilt. "That's impossible," Nolan said. "My father was a steelworker." Dr. Morris nodded. "Which makes a certain kind of sense." Nolan laughed weakly. "You're telling me my dad was the son of a billionaire?" "Yes," she said. "An illegitimate son. One who was never acknowledged." Nolan pressed his palm into the mattress, grounding himself. "So why now?" Dr. Morris tapped the folder. "Because you are his son, and because the rest of that family line no longer exists." "What do you mean?" Nolan asked. Dr. Patel spoke this time. Elliot Thornwood's acknowledged heir died years ago. No children, no surviving siblings. Extensive estate documentation confirms this. Dr. Morris finished the sentence, which makes you the only living biological descendant. The words echoed, hollow and unreal. Nolan stared at the far wall, his mind racing backward through memories, his father's quiet pride, his insistence on honest work, the way he never spoke about origins, only values. "You're saying," Nolan said slowly, "that my father never knew who he really was." "Yes," Dr. Patel said. "And you're saying I'm related to—" Dr. Morris nodded. "Your DNA confirms you are Elliot Thornwood's biological grandson." Nolan's breathing grew shallow. "That's not possible." "We understand how this sounds," she said. "That's why we triple verified. Independent labs. Independent specialists." She slid another document forward. "This is the final confirmation." Nolan didn't pick it up. "So my whole life," he said, voice barely audible, "was built on something that wasn't true." Dr. Patel shook his head gently. "No, your life was built on what was real. This doesn't erase that." But Nolan barely heard him. Images collided in his mind. Cleaning hospital floors hours ago, his mother's tired voice on the phone, Simone's text burning into his memory. "Enjoy poverty." His chest tightened sharply. Dr. Morris lowered her voice. "There's more. Elliot Thornwood passed away recently." Nolan's head snapped up. "Recently?" "Yes," she said, "which is why this information matters now." Dr. Patel placed a steadying hand on the bed rail. "Legally, this will require verification beyond medical testing. But genetically, there is no doubt." The room seemed to contract, air thick and insufficient. Nolan swallowed hard, trying to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at his hands, one wrapped in gauze, the other shaking. All his life, he had believed himself ordinary, built from discipline, from effort, from earned ground. And now the room spins. Chapter 8, Courts, Proof, and the Truth Buried. The first thing Nolan learned was that truth moved slowly, but once it moved, it crushed everything in its path. What began in a hospital room spilled outward into conference calls, sealed envelopes, and quiet meetings in offices that smelled like polished wood and old power. Within 48 hours of the DNA confirmation, Nolan was assigned a legal liaison, then another. By the end of the week, he had a team. "Mr. Webb," the lead attorney said during their first meeting, sliding a thick folder across the table, "this is no longer a medical matter. This is an estate matter." Nolan sat stiffly in the leather chair, hands folded. He still wore the hospital band around his wrist. It felt surreal, like a prop he'd forgotten to remove. "I didn't ask for this," Nolan said. "No," the attorney replied. "But the law doesn't care what we ask for. It cares what can be proven." And so they proved it. Blood samples were taken again, this time under court supervision. Independent labs confirmed what the doctors already knew. The results came back identical every time. Match confirmed. Lineage confirmed. Probability irrefutable. Adoption records followed. Files long sealed were opened under court order. Nolan sat silently as archivists laid out yellow documents, careful as surgeons. "This orphanage," a legal researcher explained, pointing to a faded letterhead, "was privately funded. One of its largest anonymous donors was Elliot Thornwood." Nolan closed his eyes. The dates lined up perfectly. The city, the discreet transfer of a newborn, the amended birth certificate that replaced a powerful name with a modest one. George Webb. His father's name sat there in black ink, unchanged, unaware. Nolan excused himself halfway through the session and stood alone in the hallway, staring at the wall until the shaking stopped. The lawsuits came next. Distant relatives emerged from nowhere, people Nolan had never heard of, suddenly convinced they were owed something. Lawyers argued. Motions were filed. Claims were dismissed. One by one. Every challenge has failed, Nolan's attorney told him during a late-night call. They don't have the genetic standing. You do. The hearings were formal and cold. Nolan wore a borrowed suit, sat straight, and answered every question calmly. Yes, that's my father. No, he never knew. No, I was not aware of this lineage until recently. The judge listened. The experts testified. The evidence stacked higher with every session. And then it was over. The ruling came down on a quiet morning. The judge's voice was measured, unemotional. Final. Based on the presented evidence, the court recognizes Nolan Webb as the sole living biological descendant of Elliot Thornwood. All assets, trusts, and holdings are hereby transferred accordingly. Nolan didn't react at first. $9.4 billion. The number meant nothing. It was too large, too abstract, like being told the distance between galaxies. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered behind barriers. Microphones pointed like weapons. Nolan didn't stop. He didn't speak. He got in the car and told the driver to go. The money arrived in stages, accounts opened, holdings transferred, signatures signed in rooms that felt unreal. Nolan read every document, asked questions, refused shortcuts. Most clients don't do this, a banker said carefully. I'm not most clients, Nolan replied. At night, he sat alone in his apartment, the same small, decaying one, and stared at the walls. Nothing had changed. The heater still rattled. The mattress still rested on the floor. His phone buzzed constantly. Unknown numbers. Voicemails left in overly respectful tones. And then, one name he recognized. Simone. Her message arrived late, just after midnight. I knew you'd be okay, it read. I always believed in you. Nolan stared at the screen. Another message followed. We should talk. There's so much we went through together. Then another. I never stopped caring. Nolan felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just a quiet clarity. He remembered the yacht photo. The words. The certainty in her voice when she said he was replaceable. Nolan didn't reply. He opened the contact, scrolled once, and pressed block. And just like that, the last unresolved line of his old life went silent. Chapter 9. Justice Without Anger. Nolan discovered that the absence of anger did not mean the absence of action. In the months after the inheritance became public record, people expected him to do something dramatic. To lash out, to burn names, to demand apologies that would never be sincere. The world had trained itself to believe that power, once gained, had to be loud. Nolan rejected that instinct entirely. He didn't want revenge. Revenge was emotional, impulsive, and temporary. What he wanted was accuracy, the kind that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be undone, and didn't require his voice to be raised. So he sat quietly in rooms where truth was assembled piece by piece. The investigators he hired were not flashy. No dramatic entrances, no threats. They were former regulators, forensic accountants, compliance analysts who had spent decades learning how people hid wrongdoing and, more importantly, how they eventually revealed it themselves. We don't chase guilt, one of them told Nolan during their first meeting. We verify patterns. That's all I want, Nolan replied. Patterns. Facts. No assumptions. They began with Victor Holbrook's public empire, his investment funds, his advisory roles, his philanthropic ventures. On the surface, everything looked immaculate. That was the point. Then they went deeper. Transaction timing. Coordinated trades placed minutes before regulatory announcements. Shell corporations with directors who never appeared in person. Consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. This isn't sloppy, an investigator said, scrolling through a projection. It's arrogant. He assumed no one would look long enough. Nolan watched silently as the web formed on the screen. And my termination? Nolan asked calmly. The room shifted. Emails surfaced, not explicit orders but implications. Conversations phrased carefully enough to deny intent, but repeated too consistently to be coincidence. Victor didn't fire you, the investigator explained. He suggested instability, questioned reliability. He let others connect the dots. Nolan nodded, and they did. Yes, that's all I need. Authorities were informed without fanfare. Evidence was submitted methodically, stripped of emotion. Nolan did not attach commentary. He did not frame narratives. He let the data speak. At first, nothing happened. Victor continued living as if untouched, private jets, interviews, social appearances. He laughed on panels, spoke confidently about ethics and innovation. Then the pressure arrived quietly. Routine audits. Requests for clarification. Delays in approvals. Victor noticed, but too late. A financial reporter called Nolan one morning. "Mr. Webb, do you have any comment on the investigation into Holbrook Capital?" Nolan paused. "I wasn't aware there was one." The reporter hesitated. "You have no involvement?" "I have no comment," Nolan said politely, and ended the call. The first public consequence came when Victor's flagship fund suspended withdrawals. Investors panicked. Rumors spread faster than explanations. Within weeks, federal agencies announced a formal inquiry. The arrests didn't come with cameras. They never did. Victor was detained in a parking garage beneath one of his towers. His phone was confiscated. His accounts frozen. His name removed from websites overnight, as if it had never been there. Nolan read the brief article online. He closed the browser without finishing it. The firm that fired Nolan felt the repercussions next. Clients asked questions. Internal emails were subpoenaed. Decisions that once seemed routine were re-examined under a harsher light. A former executive requested a meeting. "We'd like to discuss restitution," the man said, trying to sound dignified. Nolan sat across from him, hands folded. "For what?" "For misunderstandings." Nolan met his eyes. There was no misunderstanding. There was cowardice. The man swallowed. "We could make this right." "You already made it permanent," Nolan replied. "I'm not interested." Within the year, the firm lost 3 major contracts. The board reshuffled. The culture shifted, but too late. Simone unraveled last. She stayed with Victor longer than anyone expected, clinging to the image even as it rotted. When the money froze, the invitations stopped. When the headlines turned ugly, friends disappeared. She filed for divorce quietly. Nolan learned about it through a legal notification he hadn't requested. "She's petitioning for separation," his attorney said, citing irreconcilable differences. Nolan exhaled slowly. "Is there anything I need to do?" "No." Simone tried to reach him once, just once. A voicemail, shaky and rehearsed. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear. I thought he was powerful. I thought." Her voice broke. "I just wanted more." Nolan deleted the message without finishing it. Months passed. Victor's sentencing date was set. Simone vanished from public view. Her social presence evaporated. The woman who once demanded the world now struggled to be noticed at all. Nolan stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, the city stretching endlessly below him. Somewhere in that vast grid, lives were collapsing, rebuilding, being forgotten. He felt no satisfaction, only balance. Justice, he realized, didn't roar. It corrected, and once it had done its work, it required nothing more from him. Chapter 10. The Man Who Never Quit. The first time Nolan walked into the Thornwood Foundation headquarters, he did so not as a billionaire, not as an heir, but as a man who had learned the value of endurance. The building itself was impressive, modern glass and steel reflecting the city skyline. Yet Nolan's eyes immediately found the plaque near the entrance, dedicated to service and integrity. He smiled faintly. Service. Integrity. 2 words he had lived by long before the world decided his value in numbers. His assistant, a quiet woman named Marissa, greeted him at the elevator. "Mr. Webb, your first meeting today is with the hospital administrators," she said, tapping her tablet. "They're reviewing the plans for the new wing." Nolan nodded, adjusting his tie. "Show me the blueprint first," he said. His tone was calm, precise. Years of engineering training had not left him, even if the title of engineer had once been stripped away by circumstance. Marissa led him into a small conference room. Spread across the table were architectural drawings of a hospital wing, surgical theaters, patient rooms, staff facilities. Every line had been drawn with purpose. "This wing," Nolan said, tracing a finger along the blueprint, "will be named after my mother." The administrators exchanged a glance. "We're honored, Mr. Webb," one said softly. "Mrs. Webb's legacy as a nurse will live on here." Nolan nodded. He didn't respond with speeches or declarations. He simply looked at the plans, imagining the space filled with light, with care, with life. Later that day, he visited the hospital where he had once worked as a janitor. The memory of pushing a mop cart through silent corridors still lingered like a shadow. Walking now through the same hallways, wearing a suit that cost more than he had earned in a decade, he stopped in the break room. A young nurse recognized him. "Mr. Webb," she asked, blinking. "Are you?" "Yes," Nolan said, smiling faintly. "I used to work here. Night shifts." Her eyes widened. "I didn't know you well." Nolan shook his head. "I was just doing my job, just like everyone else here. You're the ones who make this place run." He moved on quietly through the halls, shaking hands with doctors and staff. Each interaction was measured, respectful. No fanfare, no need for gratitude. He understood now that value was shown, not announced. By evening, Nolan returned to his apartment, the modest space that had once held his despair. He walked past the peeling walls, the worn mattress, and paused to look out at the city lights. Despite the billions in his accounts, he remained grounded. Life had taught him that wealth was meaningless without purpose. His phone buzzed, a message from one of the doctors who had treated him. "We're holding a ceremony for the new hospital wing. Your presence is requested." Nolan smiled. He typed a short reply. "I'll be there." The next week, the hospital wing was inaugurated. Nolan stood at the podium, hands folded, and watched families, patients, and staff move through the bright halls. The plaque above the entrance bore his mother's name, a quiet testament to her dedication. "This is for her," Nolan said to Dr. Patel, who had saved him that fateful night. "She gave me my foundation. And you, all of you, saved me physically when I was at my lowest." Dr. Patel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saved yourself, Nolan. You showed up. That was the most important part." Later, alone in the wing, Nolan walked slowly down the corridors. He imagined the children who would recover here, the families who would find hope. He paused in the surgical theater and ran a hand along the countertop, picturing the janitor who had once cleaned this floor, invisible to the world, now standing in a place where his choices could help thousands. That evening, he returned home to review his charitable contributions. He had donated $4 billion across healthcare, education, and poverty relief. Schools, hospitals, clinics, scholarships, all bearing no personal branding, no insistence on acknowledgement. Nolan understood that real impact was silent, sustained, and intentional. Marissa looked up from the tablet. "Do you want the press release drafted?" Nolan shook his head. "No, let the work speak." He returned to his living room, sitting in the same chair he had used during nights of despair, reflecting on his journey. From an engineer calculating stresses and loads, to the janitor cleaning floors unseen, to the son who absorbed his father's values, to the billionaire with the means to influence change, every version of himself mattered. He allowed himself a quiet smile. "Engineer, janitor, son, billionaire," he whispered, "all of it shaped who I am." The phone rang, an unknown number flashing. Nolan ignored it. Not every call deserved an answer. Some people and events were better left behind. Instead, he opened a notebook, writing a short letter to his father, long since passed. "Dad, I hope you be proud. I didn't quit. I never stopped showing up. I tried to honor the lessons you taught me: hard work, integrity, patience. Everything else is secondary." He closed the notebook and walked to the window, looking at the city below. The streets buzzed with life, indifferent to his story, but he felt no resentment. The path had been hard, often cruel, yet it had forged him into someone capable of patience, endurance, and precision. He recalled the early mornings, alone with a mop, wondering if life would ever recognize him. He remembered Simone's betrayal, the pain of poverty, the invisible nights spent wandering the city alone. All of it was real, and all of it mattered. A knock on the door brought him back to the present. A young intern from the foundation held a stack of papers. "Mr. Webb, we need your signature here." He took the documents, reviewing them methodically. Grant for medical research, scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for rural clinics. Every line represented a life changed. Every signature a promise kept. Once finished, he stood and looked at the intern. "Thank you for your work. Remember, these programs only succeed if the people carrying them forward do so with integrity." The intern nodded, inspired but intimidated. Nolan smiled faintly. "Don't be intimidated. Be persistent. Show up." Later, Alone once more, Nolan sat in the quiet of his apartment. He poured a glass of water, raised it slightly in a silent toast, and whispered to himself, "To all the versions of me, to the nights I didn't quit, the hands I scrubbed, the mistakes I endured, the lessons I carried. Every step mattered." He looked out at the horizon, the city alive but unaware of the quiet man who had survived, rebuilt, and transformed his life. A life now defined not by wealth, not by power, but by endurance, dignity, and purpose. Engineer, janitor, son, billionaire, all versions of Nolan Webb, finally reconciled. All versions of himself honored, accepted, and intact. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The man who never quit had arrived.